Well, this is the Presidency Section A lecture. Our prioritized standard is Government Civics 16. Objectively, we're going to analyze the executive branch of the national government. There is a presidential election in years divisible by 4, aka every leap year, on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, where presidential electors are chosen with the duty of choosing a president and a vice president. So our next presidential election is going to be November the 3rd of 2020. According to the 22nd Amendment, the president serves a 4-year term, may serve only 2 full terms, and may not serve more than 10 years in office. So generally speaking, the only way you could probably serve 10 years is if you became president as vice president. If you were only elected as president, then probably 2 full terms, 8 years is as many as you could possibly have. Now, President Washington, he actually established a precedent, not president, but a precedent of presidents serving only 2 terms that was not broken until Franklin Roosevelt became president and he was elected to 4 terms. So basically, the Republicans in Congress, after FDR was elected 4 times, determined that we want this to never happen again. So they passed the 22nd Amendment that ensured that you could not serve more than 2 full terms in response to FDR breaking that precedent of George Washington. Now, the president must be a natural-born citizen, at least 35 years old, although the youngest president was not that close to 35. Theodore Roosevelt was actually our youngest president when he was 42 years old. Our youngest elected president was actually John F. Kennedy. Sometimes people make that confusion. Our oldest president is actually Donald Trump. He's the oldest person to ever become president. And they must have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. Technically, the 20th Amendment officially required that the vice president has to meet the same qualifications as the president, although most people probably would have assumed that anyway. The president and the vice president are sworn in at noon on January the 20th, following the presidential election. So if we have a 2020 election, that means they won't swear in the president until 2021 in January. The vice president assumes the presidency in the event that he or she is unable to serve, which might be due to death, resignation, possibly a removal from office. Now, the order of presidential succession beyond the vice president is actually fixed by the Presidential Succession Act of 1947. So as this chart shows you, beyond vice president, you got Speaker of the House, then the President pro tempore of the Senate, Secretary of State, on down the line. The 25th Amendment also allows the vice president to become the acting president in the event of a presidential disability. Now, this can happen if the president, in writing, informs Congress that he or she is unable to perform his or her duties. This can also happen if the vice president and a majority of the members of the cabinet deem the president unable to perform his or her duties. So possibly if you had a president that had a mental illness, you could possibly see a situation where the cabinet might decide, you know what, we don't think he should be the president right now. Now, if the president is deemed to have a disability, he or she may resume his or her presidential powers and duties by informing Congress that no inability still exists. Now, if there is a challenge to the president's ability to resume his or her powers and duties, then a 2/3 majority of Congress can actually block the president's ability to assume the presidency and therefore keep the vice president as the acting president, which would still make decisions. Now, again, you'd have to have 2/3 majority of both houses to keep the vice president as the acting president. Anything less than a 2/3 majority, the president would actually regain his powers. Now, the president is responsible for executing, which means enforcing, administering, and carrying out the provisions of federal laws. But the president does actually have some discretion as to how vigorously laws are actually going to be applied. Now, the president has the power to appoint top-ranking officers to the federal government that aid the president in executing the law with both Senate advice and consent for that to happen. So generally speaking, president picks who they want, and then they just have to have the majority of the senators agree to that. Now, positions include cabinet members, diplomats, ambassadors, heads of independent agencies, all federal judges, U.S. Marshals, federal attorneys, and other types of high-ranking officers in the armed forces. The president also has the power to remove executive branch government officials, with the exception of the vice president and the federal judges, which are technically the judicial branch. But basically, with the exception of our vice president, the president could possibly remove any other executive department official from their job if they so decided to do so. While Congress is responsible for creating federal laws, the president has the power to issue what are called executive orders, which are directives, rules, or regulations that have the effect of law. So in a lot of ways, it's the same thing as passing along Congress, except you don't need pesky Congress. You can actually go over the congressional members. Now, the president has several diplomatic and military powers, which together give the president much power in foreign relations. The president, usually acting through the Secretary of State, negotiates treaties with foreign nations, can make what are called executive agreements, and exercises the power of recognition over foreign affairs. Now, these terms, a treaty, this is a formal agreement between two or more sovereign states. Now, if you pass a treaty, you actually have to have 2/3 of the senators to actually make that effective. Now, an executive agreement, this is a pact between the president and the head of a foreign state. Does not even actually have to require Senate consent, so the president can do this independent of the Senate. And also recognition, this is formal acknowledgement of a government as legitimate by either receiving or denying diplomats. So by the U.S. recognizing a country, this means the U.S. acknowledges the legal existence of a country and therefore its government. So that's very powerful too. While Congress declares war, the president has much power in his capacity as the commander-in-chief of the nation's armed forces. The president always has final authority over and responsibility for all military matters. The president may conduct undeclared wars without congressional approval for a short time period. Generally speaking, you have a 60-day limit that you can use troops without congressional approval, which was a part of the War Powers Act. As the nature of modern warfare has changed with the rise of more covert operations deployed by the president, much can be accomplished in less than 60 days. So, for instance, the Navy SEALs that assassinated Osama bin Laden, there was no need to consult Congress because this was done in a very short matter of time. While Congress has the sole power to declare war, it is usually in response to a presidential request. Now, there's only actually been 5 declared wars in the U.S., which include the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. So anything else we've been in is just considered a conflict. The Constitution gave the president non-executive powers, which often serve as checks against the other branches of the government. For instance, the president has legislative powers that give him influence over the legislative process. The president can recommend legislation to Congress. Often through the yearly State of the Union address, this is done. The president also has the power to veto legislation, which is seldom overridden by Congress. So as of July of this year, of 2,572 total vetoes, only 111 of those have been overridden. So that means only about 4% of vetoes are overridden. So it's very uncommon to override a presidential veto. Also, the president may call special sessions of Congress. Now, this is usually reserved for national emergencies, but occasionally it has been used for less urgent reasons. The president can also make recess appointments to temporarily fill vacancies. Yet, to remain in effect, it requires Senate approval by the end of the next session of Congress. So, the president can put somebody in without congressional approval, but they do have to get that at some point. The executive branch also breaks ties in the Senate. Now, this is through the vice president serving as the president of the Senate. Now, in addition to the power to appoint federal judges, the president has judicial powers allowing for clemency, sometimes called just mercy or leniency, involving federal offenses, meaning not state laws, in the form of reprieves and pardons. Now, a reprieve is postponement of the execution of a sentence, which also includes an ability to commute sentences, which means you can reduce the amount of time that someone served, which, again, reduces that time. Or you can limit a fine. Now, pardon, this gives legal forgiveness for a crime. Pardoning power includes the ability to grant what's called amnesty, which would be a blanket pardon offered to a group of law violators, which was done after Vietnam by Jimmy Carter. Before officially becoming president, he or she must take the oath of office, which is, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. All right, this concludes Presidency, Section A lecture. Our prioritized standard, again, was Government Civics 16. Objectively, now you can analyze the executive branch of the national government.